This is the fourth part of a workshop for Philadelphia researchers looking at the 1950 census when it becomes available, it becomes public on April 1st of 2022. We're going to look at tracts to enumeration districts, something that generally genealogists don't have to worry about, but there is a resource for Philly that I want to bring to your attention. Here are the four parts of the workshop. I hope you've been doing this in order. The 1950 Philly ED maps, the federal maps, do not show all the city's street names in 1950. That's quite apparent. We tried to add, we being the one-step team, we tried to add missing names to our Philly street index. But if a street is missing from the 1950 map, how would we know? How would we know? Well, I have a number of references in my library. A complete street guide to Philadelphia, I call that the Red Guide, 1948 and 1951 editions. Hagstrom's 1940s map of street and house number map of Philadelphia. A 1952 Texaco street map. A 1984 large street map, and I have other maps as well. But I recently found this 1952 reference that actually is the impetus for this entire workshop, called 1950 Census Tract Index to Philadelphia Streets and House Numbers, and hereafter I'll call that the report, and I'll put that in yellow. I didn't have time to travel 2,300 miles from Dana Point, California to U-City to see UPenn's non-circulating U-copy, or the closed stack copy at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Center City, or the Harvard of Philadelphia Library. Instead, using interlibrary loan at Cal State Fullerton, that's my home institution. I'm an emeritus professor there. I received the copy of the report from Temple U. Quite a report. So here is the frontispiece page. I'll blow it up for you. When I got this report, I scanned it and I OCR'd it with my iPhone, actually. You can see it's the second edition. The first edition was 1937. So they updated the tract boundaries, and the names of streets, renaming streets, etc. And it's compiled by the Philadelphia City Planning Commission, and then the first one is the Philadelphia Area Census Committee, which does not exist as far as I know. Probably hasn't existed for decades. And this is pretty interesting. They claim that in preparing this revision, this 1952 revision, all data have been checked directly with current editions of the official Philadelphia street and land use maps. I didn't see those. And in many instances, with the Sanborn insurance maps of Philadelphia and information from numerous other sources in an effort to assure their accuracy and completeness, at least to the time of the taking of the 1950 census of population and housing. Besides street changes and additions, the revision involved adjustments to changes which have been made in the boundaries of several census tracts, and the adding of notations for the allocation of census tracts within the 4 new wards. They created 4 new wards, and I'll explain that, which have been created since the census tract system was adopted in 1928. So it looks like every single, from this, every single street is in this report. And they also did addresses, ranges of addresses to tract numbers. Unbelievable. What a great potential resource. Now, this report was mainly compiled by staff from the Philadelphia Planning Commission. The Health and Welfare Council of Philadelphia, Delaware, and Montgomery counties was responsible for printing and distribution, and they put a 1952 copyright line on the second page of the document. I'm not sure if that's a valid copyright. I don't think that government reports are copyrightable. And I don't think a fact can be copyrighted either. But if anyone can tell me about the council, which I believe hasn't been active in decades, probably since the 1970s, or who has some authority for the group, let me know. I want to put this online. And in the meantime, I've started a discussion with the staff of the Planning Commission to see if we, either they or myself, can get a copy of the material online. And I'm optimistic right now, but we will see. If the availability of this report changes, I'll add a link to where it is on the show notes for this video, and make a YouTube video, short video, with the link so my subscribers can be alerted. Now, I've tried really hard, and you will see in this section, to update our street index from the report. But if you can't find your Philly street on our unified tool, can't access the report, I am willing to see if I missed it on the report, and I will send you the information, the street's address for which tract number. And there's my email address, census1950@cox.net. So this is what the report looks like. It's pages and pages of these tables. And you can look here and see the inconsistency that you can find. Remember, this was done in 1952. It was done probably without computers then. Difficult with a large amount of information to put everything together. If you look at the top left, Monticello Street, explain some of the things here. It says E, which means even, O, odd side of the street, even addresses from 5200 to 5298 are in Census Tract 34E, and typically wards in Philadelphia and tracts have the same number. So typically you would have 34 tract numbers, 34 something, and ward 34. But they changed the tract in Philadelphia to get away from that. And so the 52 is the current ward for those three tracts. So therefore, if you look down to Moore Street, down here, we should see 52 on 34E and 34F. We don't. Instead, we find that 52, the new ward 52, put against the 32D and 32E. That is not correct, because you can look over to the left on Monument Street and see again there's no 52 there. So there's the lack of consistency there. But presumably these are all the streets in Philadelphia. It's amazing. If these are all the streets here, including the small courts and things of that sort, this would be a really good reference. Now, this is the second edition. The first edition was 1937. So they upgraded it. They claim that they took care of street name changes, new streets, etc., up to the 1950 census timeline. Now, let's assume that you had this document and you wanted to know the 1920 Moore Street. Where is it? What's the enumeration district? So you would go here and you would look and see, well, look, 1900 to 1999 is 1920 is right there. And it's in tract 32D. It's in tract 32D. The problem is we don't want tract numbers. We want enumeration district numbers. And there are 20 enumeration district numbers in tract 32D. So even though this is a great source, The next step is going to be to try and figure out where 1920 Morse Street is within Tract 32D to get the enumeration district number. That turned out to be not so simple. So remember, tracts are composed of enumeration districts. EDs are composed of blocks. The one-step unified ED finder tool that we showed you in the second of the four-part workshop for urban areas is a block-based search strategy. So what that means is we're going to have to figure out how to do that, how to go from a tract to an enumeration district using information from the report. So remember, I had that famous quote from Joel von Weintraub about sausages and databases, and I'm going to warn you that their sausages are ahead. If you don't want to see the details on how I incorporated the report into our street index, skip this next section. But if you had problems getting your EDs from our unified tool, couldn't find your streets on the ED maps, or couldn't find the street within the actual schedules, and if you encountered a street name on our street index with a question mark or a space parentheses question mark after the name of the street and want to find out what that means, this section is for you. And if the report goes online, well, then you can have an idea of the pros and cons of using it for missing streets. You may have to do what I'm doing to try and incorporate it into our one-step tools. Okay, so this is, or odd, I should say, right? All right. So step one, with Steve Morse's programming skills, he's a master programmer. He's also the chief architect of the 8086 computer chip, by the way. 404 lists of tracts, that's how many there are in Philadelphia, and their included street names were generated from our 1950 Philly Street Index and tract numbers from our ED definition transcriptions. Part of the transcriptions show the tract numbers, and I had to do a number of editing because there were typos not only that we made errors on, but that the Census Bureau made errors on compared to the ED map that shows tract numbers. Step two, I then searched my OCR copy, optical character recognition copy of the report by each tract number, comparing the streets I found against the newly generated tract street lists. So I'm comparing the name in their tract versus the name in our tract. And my warning is that it seemed to me that the OCR search probably missed 10 to 20% of street names in targeted tracts on the report. So it's not complete. I didn't go through it with a fine-tooth comb, but well enough to pick up missing streets. During this process, a number of mistranscriptions and typos of street names were found that I corrected on our street index. So that part was really good. It improved the quality of our street index quite a bit. In 120 of Philly's 404 tracts, our tract street index list compared to the report showed no missing streets. Now this is tract to tract. It's not ED to ED. So I still might be missing a street within an ED within the tract as long as the other EDs had the name of the street. I want to be clear on that. But there were hundreds. I was shocked. Over 800 of the report entries in the remaining tracts that were missing from our street index. Why? So let's look at some missing from street index. Well, you saw that ED map had errors. It was illegible names. We had trouble with them. Damaged map parts. Unnamed segments, trying to figure out what segment is where. It's not easy transcribing the Philly 1950 ED maps. In addition to that, I did find mistakes in assigning tracts to street addresses on the report. The report has on the back a list of corrections, but I found errors not on that last page. And I'm going to show you one because there's a double error here. As part of the report, there is a map of the census tracts. This is for 1950. I'm looking at a part of the map, and I'm interested in 48A and 48B. These are two different tracts, and they are separated by 24th Street. Here is the actual Enumeration District Map. You can see, as I pointed out before, that the tracks, you can see them really quickly because they're in these circles with large font. So 48A is on the right, 48B, 48C is down below, and the tracks, the edges of the tracks have heavy lines on the streets. Let me blow that up. Now, there's 24th Street. You can see it clearly separates 48A, and I put 48B there. That's 48B. You can see that the arrangement of the streets are quite different. Well, if, for instance, Jackson or Wolf or Ritna, well, it crosses both 48A and 48B. So we would expect to see both tracks on the report with different address ranges. However, unless things are completely crazy in Philadelphia, north-south streets like Bucknell, Bunzel, 23rd, Hamburger, I'm trying to read this, Roski, etc. Those are north-south streets. They should only be in 48A, right? You should agree with me on that. That's the nature of streets. However, if I start looking on the report for those streets in that circle, and I'm going to block this out for you to see it a little bit better here, you'll see that they put Bucknell in both 48A and 48B. Bunzel also, 23rd, Hamburger, but not Kroski. Kroski is only in 48A. That makes no sense at all. So what I think is happening here is that the streets between 24th, including Hamburger, were double counted. But not only were they double counted, but they were given different address ranges for the same street. In fact, you can even see Terrace there on 23rd Street. So they did it 3 times for the same street. Makes no sense at all. There must be some sort of algorithm that they use to try and figure out the range of addresses for a street, maybe depending upon where it is. So this is a major error on a number of different levels, and so you have to be careful. And I suspected that not only was it a problem here, but there were other areas that it might have created these, quote, missing streets. In Philadelphia, the Philly maps, they have many places, drives, courts, alleys, and terraces don't appear on my circa 1950 Philly map resources, no less the ED 1950 maps. So many of these really small, little named streets don't appear on major maps. That would be a reason why we didn't notice them. I suspect that some of the street names that we were missing might be obsolete and no longer in usage in 1950, but carried over from the first edition of the report from 1937. Others may have had their name changed, and we just didn't catch that. So step 3. From my cross table, this is why the cross table becomes so useful, I noted the EDs that were in tracts with missing streets. And with the resources I had, I tried to place the missing street within an ED number for the tract, but if I couldn't, and I tried to narrow the number that this happened, then all the EDs associated with the entry were included. So if I included 20 EDs, 19 of them wouldn't have that street at all, and the 20th may not have that street, even if it was there at one time. I used a question mark, and I'm going to show you that in two examples later, to show the type of entry I made for the missing street entry. So realize that these missing streets aren't missing. It's just a question of finding some resource that describes the street location. I mean, the report must have found them somewhere. Resources such as the geohistory website, I'll show you that, older city directories or past federal censuses might provide location information for a number of report entries. And the street name change table on the one-step site could also help. So I'm going to show you my attempts to resolve these problems. Knowing what streets were expected from an area on the Enumeration District Map caused a second closer look to reveal their presence. Maybe they were half the street, maybe a tape masked most of the name. So we picked up a number that way. If a missing street or ED, it wouldn't be an ED because we'd have to transcribe that, but if a missing street by the report was in a tract with a single ED, a one ED and a special ED, which is always inside of the parent ED, then I added the information to our street index without checking to see if the entry was actually on the ED map or my circa 1950 resources. One tract, one ED, missing, okay, I'll accept that ED that represents that missing street name. We'll put it directly on the street index. The Red Book and the report guides for some streets describe these missing streets. I'll show you the descriptions, some sample ones, and I'll use those in a modern online mapping program to find adjacent streets around that blockless target. If those streets ED number, so I entered those streets around where they said it was, if those street ED numbers from the unified tool showed it was in an ED with a range of ED numbers from the predicted tract, I added that specific ED entry to our street index, didn't put a question mark on it. And that's the only evidence I have for them, just a correlation. Of course, this assumes that Google Maps got me to the right place. And if you believe that Google will get you to the right place in Philly all the time, I got a surprise for you later. So here are some of the descriptions. A place might be the rear of something, rear of 337 New Market, rear 1071 Germantown Avenue, or a short segment from New Market near Vine East, south from 1417 Houston. So that was useful. The geohistory network and the address for it below is very, very interesting. You can put in an address and you can ask it to search through a number of different maps. It's a overlay situation with different levels. And so I put down Creston Street. That was one of the streets I was having problems with. And I said, search through maps from modern streets all the way to 1895. And I picked it up. I'm not sure which of the maps it picked it up on. You can see Creston Street. And then by entering the surrounding streets in the unified tool, I could come up with an enumeration district. I was surprised, though, that it didn't resolve many of my missing streets, however. Dr. John Logan of Brown University, at my request, provided me overlay maps of the 1950 Philly ED boundaries over the 1992 Census Bureau Tiger map. And from those images, I was able to resolve several streets put on after the ED map was produced. Remember, it's about 1941, 1942, and put them on the street index. Similarly, my 1952 Texaco Philly map and modern maps show the location of some 1950 missing streets, and I made some independent judgments and ignored report entries that I thought were errors. All right, I'm going to show you two examples, two case studies. Rinders Place shows on the report in 2B, track 2B, has 17 EDs. Okay, you notice that the question mark comes right after the place. This example from our street index, and that's how it's listed, shows a question mark immediately after the place's name. This represents a street name from the report that we had not found previously on our 1950 street index, not been located on the 1950 ED maps or my other circa 1950 references, and was in a track with multiple EDs. Okay. Now, a few names with this type of question mark may denote a partially legible map name. I really don't want to add phantom EDs to a street name on a street index, so I went out of my way, and I went to the One-Step Unified tool and started looking at past federal censuses. Remember, on the top of the Unified tool, you can change the year. Right now, the year is 1950, but you can go back in time. And I found Rinders Place only on our 1900 Census Street, and it is in Philadelphia, 1900 ED 42. Okay, two notes. EDs as two-part numbers started in 1930, so Philadelphia ED 42 is a perfectly good ED number in 1900. And Rinders Place also doesn't show on that geohistory site search box. Doesn't show. Why did it show up on the 1900 census? Well, that's an interesting story. I wondered about that. And so I went to the file, and I sometimes write notes. The public doesn't see the notes on these files. And my notes for the 1900 census file for Philly is, quote, special city notes. The Census Bureau map, the 1900 map, wasn't good enough to do the street transcription. I used an early map of Philadelphia, but it still didn't have the resolution I wanted. In addition, the outskirts of the city had problems trying to define the ED boundaries from the descriptions. I ended up going back and checking all the EDs against the census pages. Remember, the 1900 census was out for some time. So you can go, and I looked at the film, the 1900. In those days, you could only see the film at the National Archives, and they were on microfilm. Some of the EDs were done predominantly off of the census images. All in all, a difficult city. What a surprise, as some of the schedules were illegible. And looking back on that, I estimated I went through over 13,000 plus census pages on a microfilm viewer at the National Archives. Now, some of you may know that for 9 years I was a volunteer at the National Archives in Laguna Niguel nearby before they moved out to Riverside. And I started doing these street indexes in about 2001 in preparation for the opening of the 1930 census in 2002. And people said, I could hear people say to me, you won't be able to accomplish that. You can't do that. Or, that's crazy. Well, you know, they were right about one of those two things. Perhaps after the 1950 census becomes public, I can get a group of crazy volunteers together to compare our predicted streets for Philly's 3,000 plus EDs to the actual streets. That should be a high resolution. To the actual streets on the schedules, and revise the street index to reflect that reality. Wouldn't that be great for a city street index file that gave us so much trouble? So Reinders Place, the unified tool for Philadelphia 42, shows the boundary streets. So I plotted those streets on the 1950 ED map and recorded which 1950 EDs were included in that polygon, and I found only 2 of the 17 1950 EDs fell within the plotted boundary of where Reinders Place should be. And so instead of putting 17 EDs against Reinders Place, I only put 2. Second case study. Well, this is kind of interesting. In fact, I was tempted to ignore the missing street in this case. Cambridge Street, as you can see, goes through a number of tracks. It's a long street. If you look at the address range, you'll see at the higher ranges there are gaps in the numbering, which would represent large areas where Cambridge Street doesn't occur, then suddenly it pops up again. A crazy system. 44A does not have Cambridge Street. Does not have Cambridge Street, but it's right there. 44A has 21 enumeration districts. Do we want to add all 21 EDs to Cambridge Street line? Now notice the question mark here is a space, parentheses, question, parentheses. This example represents streets in our index whose name is immediately followed by space and then a question mark in parentheses. The street name was already on our street index before I worked with the report, but was not found on the 1950 ED map in the tract that the report predicted. In fact, I don't think Cambridge was ever in that tract, but I still wanted to add it to our street index. Now, this is going to give you a headache. One of my strategies with missing streets was to use the range of addresses shown for that street on the report and do a Google map search on an address within the range and see what comes up. I didn't realize until I hit Cambridge that just like me, Google Maps has trouble with Philly street locations and arrangements. Major problems. Let's look up 4450 Cambridge in Philadelphia on Google Map. That's an address that doesn't exist. That's in that tract, but is within the range of addresses on the report. Let me show you a transect of Cambridge before we do that. So here's Cambridge to the east of Fairmount Park. The address and range is from the report. It's going to cross that river. Now I'm sure all the people in Philly are just on pins and needles to see how I'm going to pronounce that river. You people have strange ways of pronouncing things. Let me see. It's the Schuylkill River. Schuylkill River. And there's a gap. Then we have Cambridge, 3800 to 4199. Then there's 4450 in 44A, no Cambridge. And then Cambridge again, we see on 5500 to 5799. Okay? So we enter 4450. Now, if you've ever entered something on Google Map that didn't make any sense to Google Map, it usually moves away from the city. You see the whole city, and you're right in the center of it. That's not what happens here. So here we have 4450 Cambridge Street. It actually showed me Cambridge Street. Amazing. And it's over here. Now I'm going to do this in real time. Watch what happens. I'm picking 4450 Cambridge Street in Philadelphia. It shows me an actual location. I'm going to go and grab the Street View icon down in the lower right. I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to drop it on that site. We're going to see that picture there. Look on the upper left. 3037 Cambridge. That's east of the river. That's not even close to the other two segments. $44.50 is right in that cemetery, that non-existent address. Wow. You think you have problems. So what I'm going to show you is the reducing possible EDs for Cambridge in track 44A from 21 to 2. Here's Cambridge to the east of 44A. It's in 24B. There's the 3800 to 4199. That's not that far away in terms of addresses to my 4450. And Cambridge is 1 block south of Girard. I assume that wherever Cambridge is, it's 1 block south of Girard. On the other side, west of the cemetery, that's in 44A, Cambridge is picks up again. And again, it's 1 block south of Girard. So it would make sense that if Cambridge did exist in 44A, it would be 1 block south of Girard. And if that's the case, Cambridge, this repeats it, Cambridge is 1 block south of Girard. So instead of adding 21 EDs to the existing Cambridge street line, I'm only going to add the 2 EDs within track 44A, that's below Girard. And I added just those 2 and added that question mark, space, parentheses, question mark, parentheses, designation. If Cambridge's imaginary extension did not cross the tract predicted by the report, it would not have been added to any of the EDs in that tract. In addition to that, I also debated Cathedral Cemetery in 44A is a very old cemetery. I don't think Cambridge was ever across that area. And so I could have very easily just omitted it, not even show those 2 EDs on the street index. But there's so many other EDs that I didn't think, I'd rather be, that 0.1%, the possibility would bother me. And I decided to put those phantom EDs within the Cambridge line. Although I'm emphasizing here streets in our street index that I put in there because of the report with question mark or space question mark endings, of the 3,122 lines of information on our street index for Philly, only 164 have a question mark, either variation, as part of their street name, or about 5% of the total. So hopefully this won't impact very many of you. And I believe, in terms of these phantom EDs, I believe it's a small price to pay to show a false positive, which were these EDs, phantom EDs, to avoid a false negative situation. Now, I think you would have guessed what one of my last slides would have been. You are at the workshop end for the 1950 Philly U.S. Census, the 4-part census workshop. My team has done as much as we can with all this, John. It's up to you, Philly. Now, I think I'll sit back and have a wood ice, waiting for the 1950 census opening and seeing what Use Philly searches can do with the index. Be gentle. Sorry if you don't. Joel Weintraub, June. Actually, This one, we started the workshop in June. I started to record it. This is July 1st, 2021. And you can see I would prefer acremes. Remember, if you find an error or an omission in the 1950 Unified tool, email Steve and myself and we will investigate and if needed, update the material. So this has been another JDW Talks with apology to Philly slang and sayings. I have YouTube talks on census resources. I think now I have 14 videos counting the workshop just on the 1950 census, which has been an interesting ride. Talks on Ellis Island. These are genealogy subjects or subjects for other researchers. Natural history topics. I am a retired field biologist, and specialty is birds. You'll see a lot of bird material, virtual birding field trips, and birding optics as well. And even maybe some biology songs that I sing on ukuleleles. So I hope this has been useful, this 4-part workshop. I hope that you don't run into too many problems when the 1950 census becomes public on April 1st, 2022, and that you get all your targets, all the information on them, and it advances your research. Have fun.